Hello, Savvy Startup students. Welcome to the latest lesson in this video series. On this particular lesson, we're going to be talking about entity operating agreements and documents. Now, I know that may not sound like the most exciting topic, but it's something that you absolutely need to know about because it's going to come in very handy for you from protecting yourself from lawsuits and making sure that in the event of an audit by the IRS, you have the documentation that you need. So, joining me here in this particular lesson is my partner with Advanced Tax Group, Tony Dixon. Tony, great to have you with us.
Thanks for having me. It's exciting to be here with the Savvy crew.
Well, I tell you what, we're talking about entity operating agreements and documents. And I got to say, this is probably going to be a relatively short video because a lot of the information that we cover will be very similar, whether we're talking about a limited liability company, a limited partnership, or a corporation, whether that's a C corporation or an S corporation. So we're going to I guess, go ahead and just dive right in and talk a little bit about these. Now, the first thing that I always want to take a look at is kind of an overview of where we're going in this particular video. In particular, we're going to talk about limited liability companies. We're going to talk about limited partnerships, which many of you probably won't be using limited partnerships, but it's something that you may grow into. And that's something I'm going to be talking about in a later video. So you want to at least be aware of these things because it may be something you add to your overall structure. And we'll cover that when we get into additional asset protection planning. So, but for now, just understand I'm going to cover a little bit about limited partnerships, and then we're going to talk about corporations. And again, as I mentioned, is not just C corporations, but also S corporations. And then we're going to talk about maybe other documentation you need from a tax consideration standpoint, as well as a legal consideration standpoint. So with that, let's go ahead and dive right in and talk about limited liability companies. And the reason that I say this with limited liability companies, that's probably the most common form of business ownership. Tony, you do a lot of setups of legal entities for our clients. What percentage would you estimate are limited liability companies rather than limited partnerships or corporations?
Man, I would say a vast majority, almost, I would say not all of them, but it's pretty close to all of them are going to be in some capacity a limited liability company.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say it's probably over 95%. And, you look at that, if somebody were to ask me, if they came to me as an attorney, and, I talked about choosing your business structure in one of the previous lessons, and that's something you may want to go back and kind of review if you're watching this right now and thinking, okay, maybe I remember a little bit about that, but hey, one of the great things about this video series is that we always make sure that you can watch these sequentially, but it's also a resource. This is not just a one and done or two and through. We want to make sure that you have the opportunity to watch these on an ongoing basis because there may be something you pick up the second, third, or fourth time you watch it that you didn't pick up the first three. So we want to make sure that you have that opportunity. And I would basically just advise you to go back and listen to that again, watch it again to make sure that you pick up some of the things you may have forgotten about. But when we're talking about limited liability companies, because that is far and away, anytime somebody asks me the one that I advise people start with, and since we're talking about a savvy startup, we always want to start with our overall first business structure, and it's generally going to be a limited liability company. Now, what you need to recognize is that when you set that up, you have to go through a certain process. You're going to go through a process with the Secretary of State's office in the state in which you reside, and you're going to want to make sure that you get that filed. You do what's called articles of organization. And that's going to be essentially where you are set up with the state, and that is going to be an important document. But at the same time, it may be called a certificate of formation. But what I want to focus on right now are the operating agreements because that's not something you're going to get from the state office. You're not going to get that from the Secretary of State's office. You're not going to get that from your initial filing. The operating agreement is something that you have to add yourself. So when you get this set up, a lot of times people make the mistake of saying, hey, I already have an LLC. I filed it with the state, so I'm good to go. Well, my rebuttal to that would be absolutely not. You are not good to go because you've got to have an operating agreement. And you'll find that out as soon as you go to the bank and try to open up a bank account for your LLC. They're going to say, okay, here's what I need. I need your tax identification number that you got from the IRS when you file that. And I'm also going to need to see your operating agreement to make sure that you're authorized to open this bank account. So that kind of leads us into what types of things does this operating agreement cover? Well, number one, it tells what you can do and in many instances what you can't do. And it governs how is this business going to operate. And what I mean by that is not just on an ongoing basis, but also when special issues arise, such as how will disputes be handled internally, and then how will things be handled externally as far as what are you as a member authorized to do? What are you as the manager authorized to do? Different operating agreements have to be customized to the type of overall business that you are. So, for instance, with a limited liability company, we can have a member managed or we can have manager managed. So, if it's member managed, that needs to state how the members are going to act and how they're going to conduct themselves in the day-to-day business. That's all laid out in that operating agreement. So typically, I mean, I've seen operating agreements that are 100 pages long. You're not necessarily going to need that. So I don't want to scare you from the get-go to think, oh my gosh, I'm going to need a 100-page document. Not at all. I've also seen operating agreements that may be 10 pages long because it covers the main things that need to be covered, and some of the things that the bankers are going to want to see, some of the things that, you recall in the earlier video, I said a lesson that I learned from my mother when I was growing up. She said, young man, if you want to be treated like an adult, you're going to have to act like an adult. Well, what does that mean exactly? Well, how do you know how the adult actually is supposed to act? Well, when it comes to a business, I say, hey, if you want to be treated like a business entity, you have to act like a business entity. Well, how does a business entity act? That's all laid out in the operating agreement. This tells how things will be handled, how decisions will be made. Now, let me just say right now, since we're talking about, a savvy startup, a lot of the businesses that you'll be starting may be just you. And if it's just you, sometimes you may think that you don't need a document to say, okay, how will disputes be resolved, or how will we handle different things? How will we, handle the voting? How will we handle the meetings? Well, you still have to have meetings. Even if it's just you, you still have to have that. Now, you may be thinking it from a dispute resolution standpoint that, well, how do I handle a dispute that I got into with myself? Well, again, I had another saying that I say in almost all my videos, and it's don't go into it, grow into it. So you may not necessarily have an advanced detailed operating agreement when you first start because it may be just you. But as your business grows, you're going to need to expand on that operating agreement to cover situations that will arise when you have multiple members or multiple people involved. And sometimes it may be that you add a member of your LLC, and that member may be another entity. And I'm going to be covering that when we get into additional asset protection planning so that you'll see how, as our business grows, our legal structure has to grow along with it to make sure that we've addressed all of the threats to our wealth building efforts. So I just want to touch on that right now to say, hey, you need some sort of operating agreement. It doesn't have to be overly complex, but you're going to need to have something. And recognize that this is the go-to resource when something negative happens, whether it be a lawsuit, whether it be an audit from the IRS, whether it be any sort of attack on your business from a regulatory agency. They're going to ask you to see this operating agreement to make sure that you have the right language in there so that they are going to give you that limited liability protection. They're going to give you the tax deductibility that you're seeking for your business as well. If you don't have this, you're not going to get the benefits that you're looking after. Tony, are there any issues or maybe stories that you would share on this, or just kind of points that you think people need to understand?
It's I'm glad you asked. The when it comes to these legal documents, I mean, we've set up a tremendous amount of these entities, and as you've explained, and as these savvy clients are going to see in all of our video series, there are multiple purposes to setting up a business. Sometimes it's for legal protection purposes, and sometimes it's for tax purposes. But they do work collectively together to make sure that you're achieving one unified goal, which is protecting your wealth. And that comes through protecting your assets from lawsuits and lowering your tax liability through the proper formation and filing of taxes. But one thing that we see a lot with like for example, an operating agreement, word for the wise is, well, whenever you have this set up, this is a very important document. Keep a copy of it. You'll want to have a copy of it accessible to you and know where you keep it. A lot of times clients call in and say they can't find that document and we'll need to resend it out to them. And that document can change over time. So that's also something that you just need to keep in mind when it comes to the operating agreement.
Hey, thanks, Tony. I appreciate that input because it's something that people need to realize, because typically people will hear about the negative aspects of what happens. They think, oh, that'll never happen to me. And everybody that it happens to didn't think it was going to happen to them either. So the thing is, we hope for the best, but we've got to plan for the worst. That's something that one of the best pieces of advice that I could give you is, again, hope for the best, but you got to plan for the worst. That's why we're here. That's what we do when we work with clients is we say, hey, we're here so you can focus on your business. Let us focus on some of the legalities and some of the requirements from a tax standpoint as well. We'll help you with that. You focus on making sure that you're able to take care of your customers, take care of your clients, and make sure you're able to take care of your business as a whole. Now, the next one I want to talk about is, limited partnerships. And I'm not going to belabor the point a whole lot. You're typically going to have the same thing from the state where you're going to have that articles of organization for setting up that limited partnership. You're going to have maybe a certificate of formation. Different states call these different things. But what you're not going to have from the state is a partnership agreement. And that is exactly what you need. Now, when we're talking about a partnership, by definition, there is going to be more than one partner, because if you don't have two or more parties, there is no partnership. Now, that being said, sometimes people will set up a partnership where they are the limited partner themselves, and then they'll establish another legal entity, maybe an LLC or a corporation, that will serve as the general partner. Now, that's something that comes into play quite a bit, and sometimes there are benefits that people can get with the utilization of limited partnerships that is not necessarily available. A lot of that's changed. You can get a lot of the benefits of limited partnerships with the limited liability companies, but I just want to make sure that people understand right now that when we're talking about limited partnerships, everything is very similar to a limited liability company, but it's not going to be an operating agreement. It's going to be a partnership agreement. So I just want to make sure that everyone understands, and that's going to lay out how are decisions made, who is in charge. I mean, the general partner is going to be the one that's calling all the shots. So then we've got to say, okay, well, what about the limited partner? What do they do? Well, actually, they're not going to do much of anything. That's where they get protection because they're not doing anything. Well, then that lays out who is authorized to take action on behalf of the limited partnership. All of that is laid out in the partnership agreement. You're not going to get any of this from the state. The state doesn't provide you with any of those details. And part of the reason I'm pointing this out is that people mistakenly believe, a lot of times you see these companies online that'll offer services that, hey, we'll help you establish your entity. And they say it's so cheap, so easy, we'll do this all for you. But then what they don't tell you is that all they did was the filing with the state. Well, you could have done the filing with the state pretty easily. The hard part is making sure that you're able to jump through these hoops on having the operating agreements, on having the partnership agreements. So that's why I want to make sure that you understand. And when I say that there are tax considerations and legal considerations, a lot of this that is laid out who's responsible for the taxes. That's going to be in the partnership agreement. That's going to be in the operating agreement for the LLC. Who has legal responsibility? Those are legal considerations that need to be addressed. They're once again all addressed in these operating documents. Now, let's transition over to corporations. With corporations, you're going to have your articles of incorporation. That basically just shows you have been established with the state, but what you're not going to get from the state are your bylaws. The bylaws are similar to the operating agreement with the LLC, and they're similar to the partnership agreement with the limited partnerships. Again, this is where it lays out what is required for the corporation to take action. Now, you may recall in a previous lesson that we shared choosing the legal structure, I told you that corporations have the most stringent requirements and the highest level of maintenance. Because with corporations, at an absolute minimum, number one, you're going to have shareholders or stockholders, and then you're going to have directors and officers. So you've got to make sure that every year you have an annual meeting of your shareholders and you have an annual meeting of the board of directors. So that requires, once again, a minimum of 2 meetings per year. As I shared in that previous lesson, and I'll share with you again, you may want to have multiple meetings because that gives you multiple opportunities to write off certain expenses that, maybe to travel to a location where you're going to hold your meeting. Now, all of a sudden, those expenses associated with that meeting, those are deductible. So that's a great opportunity for you to take advantage of some tax benefits as well. Tony, this may be a good opportunity to talk to you about that, just as far as what you've seen maybe with some tax benefits that people have taken advantage of by taking advantage of those meetings and maybe traveling to different locations. I know it's something you and I have talked about. And as a matter of fact, one of our recent meetings, we talked about, we've got one of our members of our tax team is in Colombia. We said, we may have to have a meeting in Colombia. What are your thoughts on some of these things?
No, you're absolutely right. We were just talking about setting up our next team quarterly meeting and finding a location to travel to. Now, depending on how you set up the business, like you're talking about, JJ, and depending on how you classify that business from a tax standpoint, all of that's found in those initial documents that we've talked about in some of the other videos. When filling out the SS4 and working with the IRS, that determines the specific tax forms that you're going to be responsible to prepare and file. But the business that you choose also opens up a whole world of tax deductions that you can start utilizing. So traveling to location to hold these meetings that JJ's talking about, travel expenses, food expenses, there are hundreds of different types of expenses that can be utilized within the world of running your own business. And so whether you have a board of directors or not, or a team that requires you to travel to hold these meetings or not, doesn't limit you from being able to start from taking these types of tax deductions. I mean, there are deductions where you can, pay your children to be some of your first employees and help you with the business and take those types of deductions. But it all goes back to, how are you setting this up? What are these tax considerations that you are looking at? And how are you selecting that business to be set up and taxed or viewed by the IRS? Because in those selections, it leads to all kinds of then accessible deductions that you're going to be able to utilize, from car expenses to paying your children, to retirement accounts, to travel expenses, cell phone bills, cars. I mean, all of these things are now potentially deductible expenses that you're going to be able to tap into, which is awesome for you as a business owner.
And for a lot of people, that's part of why they set up a business to begin with, is that they say, hey, now I get some tax treatment that I'm not going to get as an employee. So it opens up an entire world of new deductions, which means more money in your pocket, because we're not having to pay the IRS because we have legal deductions. And that's something that we want to make sure we always maximize as much as possible. Now, we don't want to spend money just for the sake of spending money. But if we have something we would like to spend money on, we would definitely want to do it in a way that is tax deductible. And determining how the money flows back and forth as far as reimbursements or anything like that, that's going to be laid out in many instances in these operating agreements as well. So that's why these documents become so important. And if we kind of recap here, what we talked about with limited liability companies, we have operating agreements. With limited partnerships, we have partnership agreements. And with corporations, we have bylaws. And then when we talk about other documentation, maybe receipts, how do we document this? Maybe minutes of meetings and resolutions that are passed at those meetings. We need to have some sort of a historical record. So when we're looking at all of these things, this is what we do on a regular basis. We work with clients, we help them to make sure that they have all those I's dotted, the T's crossed, so that when the time comes that, sadly, we live in a society where lawsuits are running rampant. So it's not a matter of if you'll be sued, it could be a matter of when. So we've got to make sure that we have done all of the documentation the right way to protect ourselves from those lawsuits. And at the same time, if we're wanting to maximize our tax deductions, number one, we don't want to push it too far. But number two, if somebody wants to take a closer look, we need to make sure that we have the right documentation. And a lot of this is going to be laid out in the operating agreement, the partnership agreement, the bylaws. So that's why this becomes so important. Now, I told you that sometimes this doesn't sound like it's the most exciting information, But I got to tell you, when you start talking about making sure that I'm protected, I'm excited about that. When it talks about making sure that I'm able to take trips and write off things that I wouldn't otherwise be able to write off, well, that's pretty exciting as well. The key is making sure that you have access to this information and building a team around you that you can turn to ensure that you are taken care of. So hopefully you have learned some valuable information and some valuable tips here. And if you'd like to learn more, you can always reach out to us. We'd love to help you. That's what we do. So thank you so much for watching this video. Be sure to come back, watch it again, and watch all the videos again as part of this Savvy Startup series. Thanks for watching.